Well, thank you very much for coming this evening, and I want to thank at the outset President Pollard, the president of JBU, for making funds available to do a nice filming of the event. Also, his office made possible a nice dinner for the veterans beforehand, so thank you, President Pollard, for that. Thanks to the audio-visual crew who's put this together, and they've been here for several hours. Thinking of Darren Gold, Bear Clenda, and Andrew Stockman, and the others. Thanks very much for that. Just real quick, if we could see how many the veterans we have in the audience. If the veterans could just raise their hands, the veterans we have here. And then, thank you, yeah. For sure. And then particularly the Vietnam veterans. Who are the Vietnam vets we have out here? All right. Well, we're very happy to have the Vietnam vets here. Thank you. So the order of the program this evening is we'll quickly go into the discussion. We plan to wrap the discussion up about 7:45. Then we'll have folks come up and greet the veterans. We'll have a break of about 10 or 12 minutes. And then a class of mine at America, the class is called America at War. The students in that class will stay back for a question and answer time, and anyone else who's interested in staying back for Q&A time, you're definitely welcome. So that the Q&A will start about 10 minutes after the event. Also, just to let you know, over here we have a display of various things from the war, from the Vietnam War, but also going back to a prior war, what was called the French Indochina War. And so a lot of items from the wars over there on those tables. So we're going to start with Chris Dyer. And Chris Dyer is a lifelong friend of mine. He served 20 years in the Marine Corps. We didn't plan for our three guests this evening to be Marines, but that's how it works. So we have three Marines, and I'm Navy myself, so I thought it would be better to have a Marine bring the three Marines to the stage. And so we're going to have Chris Dyer bring our three Marines to the stage.
Can you hear me? Good? Okay. So our first guest is a student leader and star basketball player, both at JBU and in the military. He graduated from JBU in 1965 with a degree in social studies education. United States Marine Doug Chamberlain.
Come on, Doug. Thank you, Doug. Great to see you.
Second guest is also a student leader. He graduated from JBU in 1967 with a degree in mechanical engineering. United States Marine Ron Maines. Ron Maines. And our last guest is a star athlete, remembered especially for his abilities as a swimmer. He graduated from JBU in 1971 after returning from Vietnam with a degree in physical education. United States Marine Mike Bryant.
Good luck, guys. Sit down. Stand easy and speak.
Yeah,
the mic's on.
Of course, there are many other Vietnam vets from JBU. We just have three on the stage, but there are many others. One of them was named Sam Meese, and I've just recently been in touch with him. He was with here at JBU with the Young Americans for Freedom, with the Foreign Missions Fellowship, with the Christian Workers Fellowship, with the concert bands, with the choir, with the pep club. And so maybe it's not surprising that he was also very active in Vietnam. He served with the U.S. Navy, and he was awarded a Silver Star, which is given for singular acts of valor or heroism. This is an article in a regional newspaper here published in '67 when Sam Meese came back. Mm-hmm. Another of the JBU students who went to Vietnam but did not survive was Mike Cavanaugh. And Mike was in the Broadcasters Club. He was on the dorm council. So I don't know exactly what that is, but it sounds like a power, like a position of power. He was a wrestler, and then his sister also was a student here. And Mike was a corpsman, Navy corpsman, who served with the Marines. And so we'll start our discussion with Ron, because Ron remembers Mike. And so Ron, when you think of Mike, what comes to mind?
Well, Mike started out with our class, class of 67 in 1963. By the end of his sophomore year, he read a lot about the war, and he felt constrained that he wanted to go and to contribute and not finish his college education. So he went in as a Navy corpsman and volunteered to serve with Marines. And he was in country. There you can see June 2nd, 1969, and was going into a zone on an H-46 helicopter. And it crashed in the zone, and it came under fire, and he was lost in battle.
He was lost in battle. So he was a corpsman, and this Navy corpsman we see here, Donald Kirkham, he was mentioned at a similar event that we did. And I've noticed that the Marines will often speak of the work of the Navy corpsman. You can see that we have one there. This photo was taken at the Battle of Way at the end of January 68, maybe early February 68. Doug, when you think of the work of the Navy corpsmen, of course you had them with you all the time, I'm sure. What comes to your mind when you think of the work of these Navy guys who found themselves in combat situations with Marines?
Well, excuse me, Preston, we didn't think of them as Navy guys. They were Marines to us. And I'm proud of everybody that served, no matter what branch the service they're in. Yeah. But the corpsmen were a very unusual bunch. And some of the most courageous people you could ever see. And I would like to digress here for a moment, if I could. These two gentlemen here, and corpsmen and radio operators, are really the heroes of the Vietnam War. The helicopter crews, the sacrifices, the risks they took for those of us on the ground can't be described enough. And with the corpsmen, the real truth of the matter was we had to make them look like everybody else. There's none of this putting a white cross on them or anything. That was just a target. I had them carry rifles just like everybody else, so they looked exactly the same. But when the action started, they knew what they were supposed to do, and they always did. Great kids.
Yeah, I mean, you're indicating that unlike the war against the Germans, for example, in World War II, if a medic is marked with the cross, then I think usually the Germans would go by the rules of war and not target that medic. But this was a very different war, and if they are marked as medics or corpsmen, then that would actually make them a target. In this war, Mike, what comes to your mind when you think of the Navy corpsmen?
To go along with what Doug was saying, the Marine Corps claimed them as our own, even though they were Navy. We claimed them as our own. These guys, Jerry's seen it, and he's done medevacs too. I mean, it was just unbelievable what they would do and the courage that they would go through fire to save a fellow Marine. And the medics in the Army were the same way, and not enough can be said about them. And I'm going to take a dive past too, is the sole purpose of the helicopters in Vietnam was to serve these guys over here. They're the ones that was in the mud and the grud, and our purpose was to do whatever we could do to help them. So,
yeah. Well, let's set the stage for those of us who maybe don't have much of a background. If you don't know where Vietnam is, there it is. Got it marked out for you. The war that the United States fought in Vietnam beginning in the early 1960s was sort of a war that followed another war that the French fought in what had been their colony of Indochina. And in a sense, the U.S. picks up where the French left off. A major concern was at the time of the Cold War was the spread of communism. And there was worry that if all of Vietnam became communist, then that would threaten other countries in the region. And so the desire is to stop the spread of communism, and that idea is referred to as the domino theory. And so the main task of American forces, along with allies from Australia, or allied forces from Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, South Korea, the main goal was to prevent what was then South Vietnam from coming under communist control. This war involved a number of presidents. Actually, we could go back to President Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, but certainly President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, when things really begin to heat up. President Johnson, of course, is the president most associated with the war. President Nixon. Then we could also mention, I guess, President Ford at the end. Our three veterans all served in the northern part of what was then South Vietnam in a region called First Corps, but usually referred to as I Corps. So that northern part of old South Vietnam, all of our guests this evening served there. And so, just as a reminder, we have with us then Doug Chamberlain, infantry. We have Mike Bryant, helicopter pilot in the war, and we have Ron Maines, helicopter pilot in the war. So we've just mentioned your jobs, and I have a photo here from Ron. There's a photo from Ron, photos from Mike, and then this is a photo from Doug's collection of just one of the areas of operation. And so when we think about mission, let's go to Mike first. And Mike, go at it any way you want, but
Okay.
What basically was your mission in the Vietnam War?
We flew the CH-46. The CH-46 was the medium helicopter. We, Marine Corps, used it like the Army used the Huey. With that 46, we did everything. We did medevacs with it. We did recon inserts and extracts with it. We did troop inserts. We did resupplies, and then we did recon missions. That was part of my time there. The last few months that I was there, I was what's called a civic action officer. I worked with the Vietnamese people in a village just south of Marble Mountain, and working with them to try to get a school and a dispensary, and which was pretty rewarding working with them.
Mm-hmm. Ron, how about you? So just to sort of put some of that in layman's terms, dropping troops off, picking troops up, picking up wounded troops, dropping off supplies. What would you add to that theme of, going back to your photo, the theme of mission?
Well, it's pretty much the same. Mike was about 2 or 3 years ahead of me over there, but the chopper was used. If you could have the other picture of the aircraft, you can see a 50 caliber machine gun there in the waist on the side, and you can see it in the other one below the number 17, and that was a defensive weapon, and its job was to kind of help us get in and out of zones if they were contested. Many were. And the main job was support the Marines, get them in as quickly as you could, get them out as safely as you would. And we were all 23 years old. I had less than 400 total hours. You're flying day, night, all kinds of weather. That's a formula for disaster. But we stuck together, and you want to never leave a Marine behind.
Ron, when you, I want to get back to what you just said, never leave a Marine behind. Well, I'll ask you a question, then we'll go to Doug, and Mike, feel free to jump in. When you look back now, you say you were 23, you're flying this very complicated machine, which is, by itself, something to notice. But you're also doing it sometimes when people are shooting at you, and there's all sorts of stress. And, as you look back now, does that kind of amaze you that you were doing this stuff when you were 23 years old?
Well, it's something you don't want to think about. We said the helicopter, our chopper was 10,000 nuts and bolts flying in close formation, built by the lowest bidder. And but it was a solid platform. It would take a lot of fire. It would stay up, but when it took too much, it would come down hard. I didn't think much about it. When you're there the first few weeks, you're kind of getting acclimated, and all of a sudden a light bulb goes on and says, those people really are trying to kill me. And that kind of added it to the mix. And but there's always a saying in aviation, we use it today: fly relaxed or you'll die all tensed up. That's a joke.
Right, yeah. Fly relaxed or die all tensed up. Well, tell this. Let me ask you one other question, then we'll come to Mike and Doug. Because you and I were talking a week or two back, and you flew helicopters off ships often. Not all the time, but often off of ships. And you used the phrase, feet wet, feet dry. And you would talk about, and Mike, feel free to respond to this as well, you would talk about how the sense of things would change at the moment you go from feet wet, that is over water, now your feet dry over land. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, you're over the water, you're on your way in, you've received your mission, you know how many other aircraft are involved. But there's a lot of banter that goes on in the cockpit. I mean, you're just guys, and you know, the Clint Eastwood movie was on that night, and you know, steak night was Saturday night, so you were kind of into that. But once you hit feet dry, which means you were over the land, you were about 10 to no more than 20 minutes out, and you kind of took on another. You got more alert, and the banner stopped. No one said, "Don't talk to me anymore," or not going to talk anymore. You just kind of sat up in your seat, grabbed the controls, and started looking out, and knowing that you had a mission to complete. You either had means on board, or you had supplies on board, or you're going to pick them up.
Yeah.
And you didn't know what you were going to find.
Right.
I had an idea, but it didn't always work out that way.
I mean, sometimes you get a report saying that it's not a hot zone, meaning that there's not fire, but that's the enemy actually waiting for you to get there. Is that right?
Or the move of battle was shifting, and in the I Corps was NVA, not VC, the North Vietnamese Army, and they would, you know, be moving on a position, and maybe that changed before you got there. And it was surprise.
Yeah. Well, let's stick with the helicopters just for a minute. Mike, you were around the same age, 23?
No, I was a little older.
24?
I was like 25.
Wow,
Okay.
you were real old.
I was in school a long time.
Did they call you Pappy or whatever when you were there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
Well, so, I mean, but still, does it amazes me when I think of a 25-year-old, first of all, operating such a complicated machine, but then often in context, and I know that you have stories where, I mean, you know, there are people out there ready to take you down, and some very close calls. When you look back on that, does it kind of amaze you that a 25-year-old was pulling that off?
I think back when I was like 25, and guys are 23 years old, and in the Army, some of their pilots were 19 years old, and we had some that were 19 years old. And you go, good grief, the government's given me a multi-million-dollar aircraft to play with. And, you know, it's kind of an awesome responsibility because you actually sign for the aircraft each time. Thinking back, you know, you just go, I mean, I'm amazed there's 3 of us sitting up here, to be honest with you. You think back about all the close calls, times it shouldn't have been that were.
Yeah.
So.
Doug, your mission, of course, is very different because you're on the ground. When somebody asks you that question, just, you know, what was your mission? Here's a photo from your collection. This is one of your areas of operation, and tough area. What comes to your mind?
Well, part of our mission was to ride in the back with these guys, talk about having steak for dinner and what movie they're going to watch. I mean, we thought they were talking about, oh man, how are we going to get these guys in there, you know? And,
Yeah.
But what they didn't tell you is that when they fly, they're the pilots in command of that aircraft. And at any time that somebody on the ground like me needed help or needed supplies or whatever, they had the sole discretion on whether to come in or not. And so they would always ask us, you know, if we'd take any ground fire or anything, and we always lied. and said no.
Yeah.
And now I really would have said it if I had known what they were talking about.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah,
Talking
do
about
it.
We'd be going out and you're going for a medevac, and your first contact with the people on the ground, you ask them what the nature of the medevac is, and they'll say it's a gunshot wound. And your next question is, okay, what's the enemy situation? And they'll go, well, there's none. And then you go, well, when's the last time you took enemy fire? And they'll say, negative fire in the last 24 hours. And then you go, well, how do you have a gunshot wound that's they go, well, wait one. Make that the last 10 minutes that we had fire.
Yeah.
Well, and really, I was interested to hear you say that you had contested landings. Well, for us in the back, we were taking fire. And a lot of times you could see tracers going through the helicopter, and these guys are sitting up there talking about supper, That baffles my mind. But
Yeah.
Our mission really was, among other things, I would say first and the most difficult was to win the hearts and minds of the people. And in the fall of 1967, in their wisdom, the U.S. government decreed that they would have elections in all the villages and hamlets in South Vietnam. And I had, if my memory is correct, I think 13 villages and hamlets I was responsible to get these little guys elected, and they would be kind of like a mayor in our situation, but they hadn't had elections. And of course, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese told them they weren't going to have elections. And in the weeks leading up to Election Day, they successfully assassinated 12 of the 13 candidates for office, all in my area of TAOR, Tactical Area Responsibility. So the last village, the guy was still alive, and I put him on a sampan out in the Gulf of Da Nang Harbor the night before, so we would have one candidate for election. And that morning, when they brought him in, the South Vietnamese that were supposed to be his security force, when he walked up the beach, pumped about 35 rounds in him, and they were obviously Viet Cong wearing South Vietnamese uniforms. So all those social interactions and political actions were only a part of what we did, and the rest of the time we spent trying to contain the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese military units.
I mean, you're just sort of suggesting how complicated this thing was. Viet Cong, who are, usually don't fight in uniforms, but now they're dressed in the uniforms of South Vietnamese forces, who are your allies. And then you refer to the civilians, who often are getting stuck in the middle. And you've written your memoir, which I've read twice, and this is a theme that comes up a number of times in your memoir, just how difficult this was, just things you saw and experienced as these villagers, folks who just wanted to grow rice and have their own lives. They're stuck sort of between two fires. Is that correct? Do you think that's the correct?
That's really true, and one of the things that happened, the only foreign language I knew was English. And John Brown III told me before I left, you'll never need to know anything else but English. But the language barrier was phenomenal.
Right.
And there was an old saying back in those days, if you hold a gun to their head, they'll speak perfect English. But that was obviously somewhat of a moronic statement, but it was amazing. And in my book, I referred to Huey, a little Vietnamese boy, 14 years old, that acted as interpreter for me a lot. And because
Let me jump forward to the picture of you and Huey.
He would just stand around and listen, because the Kit Carson scouts that we had were supposed to be interpreters for us. The Viet Cong had infiltrated those to the point that we couldn't trust them. And so I'd have Huey stand around and listen when they talked to the villagers, and then Huey'd come and tell me what the villagers really said.
Yeah. So this is a 14-year-old kid. We can see how he's dressed. He's got on the flip-flops there. I think in your memoir you say we tried to put boots on him or something, and he wouldn't put up with it.
Yeah, he just wore those, I don't know what, I can't remember what we called them now, but they
Yeah.
were made out of rubber tires, actually.
Yeah.
Just, we call them shower clogs or something, you know,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that's all he wore. And so we were able to arrange to get him a set of combat boots. And boy, his eyes were that big, and he wore them for about 15 minutes. And he couldn't stand the way they fit.
Yeah, yeah. We have a pair of those actually over at one of the tables. Well, let's go back to. We might come back to that photo there, but let's go to this, and we can go at this any way you want. I'll go to Ron first, then Mike, and then Doug on this one. I mean, Ron, you can tell us a little bit about this photo. You know, one of the things that comes to my mind is, you know, in Washington, D.C., when folks are talking about the war, they're talking about the war as, you know, an ideological conflict or something. And then there's what the 19-year-olds on the ground are actually experiencing, and often these things seem very, very different. But, you know, we can start with this photo here. I mean, Ron, maybe you could tell us about this photo, but then also, you know, how does the reality that you experienced, how is that different from what you may have expected when you were a student here at John Brown, you know, knowing that you'd probably end up in Vietnam?
Yeah, the story on this one's very short. Whenever a chopper went down, then they would try to bring them back if they could recover them. And this was a Huey that had crashed. Once you lose your aerodynamic support, you take up the flight path of a rock, and two of the crewmen were killed, co-pilot lived, and a Jolly Green Giant, our H-53s, brought that back, and it's just a photo. There's no other story. So
Yeah. How about the sort of the reality question? I mean, the actual day-to-day experience.
Yeah, you know, during the first couple of weeks, what they would do is they put a senior pilot who was ready to go home with a junior pilot that was just getting ready. And we'd do a lot of what we call gravy runs. We'd run out to the hospital ship, the Sanctuary, USS Sanctuary. We would run back and forth to Marble Mountain, carry VIPs around. I'm saying, this is pretty good. You know, I like more of this. Well, then the senior pilot went home, and you were all checked out, and became a co-pilot on the missions that were the real live missions. And that's when you're, first of all, you notice that you could probably get hurt doing this job. It only took about a month to 6 weeks to realize that what they offered on the menu wasn't they served up on the meal. And you'll see it written a lot in history books now that young men of that time lost their innocence. Being here in John Brown is a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. You line up at phones to call girls so you can get dates. You have to call them on Wednesday night so they can go out Saturday night. You can relate to that now, can't you? Yeah. And achieving in academically, and getting your degree, and Carol had an extra year, and I went on to officer's candidate flight school. She joined me in Pensacola before we went to California. I went overseas. The reality was this was totally different. The only thing I can say, hopefully without a lot of emotive terms, is that war is terrible, and in a lot of cases it's as close to hell that we will ever know on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's all I'm going to say about that.
Sure. Mike, how about you? I mean, you had a lot of tough experiences over there.
It's kind of similar. Excuse me. I was stationed at Marble Mountain. The aircraft that I was flying, the CH-46, was grounded because it had a nasty habit of the aft end of it falling off, and it wasn't good for morale.
The back part of the helicopter
Yeah.
falling off.
Yeah, it wasn't good for the morale.
That could be a bummer.
But they were doing the mods on it. They fixed it, and it turned out to be a very good aircraft. And when I first got there, I was one of the first co-pilot that had checked into the squadron in a few months. So, you know, I was like raw meat.
Yeah.
And I got chauffeured around, like you're saying. They showed me this stuff. The first one I actually got launched on was, and I can't remember if it was called Bald Eagle or Sparrowhawk. Do you remember those?
Sparrowhawk.
Yeah. And
great place to visit.
a recon team that they had tried to extract and couldn't extract, so we was going to put a reactionary force down at the bottom of the hill. We had 13 Marines in our aircraft, and Bill Young was the pilot, I was the co-pilot. And we flew out there, and I was watching the jets fly, and they were bombing things. I said, hey, this is just like the movies. You know, and then all, you know, it was going on, and I was leaning forward looking at all this good stuff, and then the Huey guns come in, and they're rat-tat-tatting around and stuff, and I thought, this is still just like the movies. And so when they called, our call sign was Bonnie Sue. Said, Bonnie Sue, you ready? And he said, yes, we're going to come in, low-level, high-speed approach. And I'm still just kind of looking around and stuff, and here we go. And as we come into the zone, of course, there's boulders and rocks everywhere. The crew chief's leaning out, saying forward, forward, trying to direct us into landing. And just about the time that he said, set her down, we got opened up on at 360 degrees from the spider holes. And I found out what the armor seat was all about. I went back into my armor seat. My eyes were probably about this big. And we wobbled out of the zone, and the pilot was, you know, saying, don't come in. The other one, don't come in, it's a hot zone, hot zone. So as we're out and going away, the crew chief came up, Jackson, and we had what's called bullet bouncers, chicken plates, or what do you want to call them, right from here and covered this part. Well, he had a hole above his lip mic had been shot away, and he was trying to tell us that Delu, which was our gunner, had been shot. And I look back there, and there's Delu laying on the ground back there. Neither one of them was killed, and then right then I'm going, okay, Mrs. Bryant, little boy Michael is not going home, is what I thought.
Wow.
And that was I'm kind of glad that happened at the very first part of it, because you knew what to expect, what was going to go on, and you started paying a whole lot more of attention.
Yeah. Mike would not tell us, but in this photo you can see he's wearing a Purple Heart. Are you willing to tell us what it was that led to that Purple Heart?
Fred was my co-pilot. We were on a emergency medevac down south of Da Nang, and we got called in for a couple of emergency medevacs. And you also, when you're making your contacts, you try to find out if you've got any friendlies out patrolling and stuff, so you can tell your gunners where they can fire and where they can't fire. And it was all treated, trees everywhere. You couldn't see where the patrols were. And so they said, we do have patrols out. So I told my gunners, I said, we can't, you can't return fire unless you absolutely 100% see where it's coming from. And we went in, we picked up our medevacs. As we were coming out, we were taking fire again on the way out, all over, no matter which way I was turning, we were taking fire. So I was really trying to wrap it around. I had it wrapped as tight as I could get it, trying to come around, and the middle console exploded. And we'd taken some fire through there. I thought we took an airburst, but it wasn't. It was just an AK-47. Anyways, the bottom line is it's shrapnel from going through the cockpit from those rounds, in which we normally, that's happened lots of times. You can pick it up, you get a lot of that type of stuff. And our CO met us at the flight line. We took our guys to the medevacs, we took them to the hospital, and we went back to the flight line with battle damage. And our CO and our operation op met us there, took us down to sick bay. It's kind of like a football game, patch you up, pat you on the butt, and send you back out.
Out you go. So not much of a break.
Yeah.
Wow. Doug, so we're thinking about this theme of, war as something you see in movies, which to a typical 18-year-old guy might seem like fun, and then there's the reality. I'm wondering what your thoughts are. I mean, maybe we could just reflect on this photo. You look at the photo, it seems like a very beautiful scene, and it actually is a beautiful scene unless a war happens to be going on, and I know this was a tough area. What comes to your mind? Mike sort of initially, Mike and Ron both initially said, well, this seems like it might be kind of fun, but then reality sets in. What thoughts come to your mind when you think of the reality of war and of combat?
Well, a couple of things involve helicopters, and as I said, I think without helicopters, the fatality rate in Vietnam would have been 4 times what it was.
Sure.
And of course, it wasn't a helicopter. They weren't drones. They were flown by real live people. And we had what we called jungle penetrators on a winch on the side of the choppers. And these guys would come and take out our casualties in the jungle areas. It wasn't unusual to have 300 feet high canopy. That's how high the trees were. And there might be 2 or 3 layers under there. And they'd drop this jungle penetrator down. We'd put our killed and wounded on there, and then they would winch them up through that canopy. And if they had just let the aircraft drift sideways or anything, you'd be pulling those guys sideways through the canopy and would have put their eyes out, additional injuries. And that sort of skill was an everyday practice for them. But I can't tell you how much it meant for those of us on the ground. We did end up threatening one helicopter, however, one day. They were bringing in supplies to us in a sling. And these guys, because they were afraid of that ground fire they were talking about, they would have to come in pretty high so that they didn't get shot at. And then they'd get over close to us, and then they'd come down fairly fast. Well, this guy, we had water. We normally had to drink out of the rivers and stuff, but we were having water brought in, and sea rations, and mail.
And when the temperature is regularly 100 degrees and the humidity's crazy, that
Oh,
water's
at least
very nice.
that.
Sure.
And this guy starts coming down with that net. He stayed up high, started coming down with that net, and apparently exceeded the capabilities of the aircraft. Well, when they do that, they have to cut that net loose, or they're going to crash. And this guy cut that loose so high in the air that when it hit, it ruptured all those containers of water, and it got our mail wet.
Oh.
So I told the radio operator to get on the radio and tell the guy, if he ever came back, we're going to shoot him down.
Yeah.
I'm sure he got a chuckle out of that.
Yeah. Let me stick with you, Doug. We've seen this photo of you and Huey. What you wrote in the back of the photo tells us a little about him. When you look at that photo now, I mean, Huey might still be over there in Vietnam in his probably his 50s, maybe his late 50s, something like that. But what thoughts, when you think of this one Vietnamese kid who was so helpful to you, what thoughts do you have these days?
I'm sure he was a target for the North Vietnamese when they overran the country. In my book, I put a verbal prayer in there for him, that wherever he is, I hope that he's alive and that he has been able to survive, but I'm not optimistic.
Right. When Saigon falls in 1975 and the North wins that war, there were a lot of reprisals against
A lot of
South
reprisals.
Vietnamese who had helped.
The Amerasian children, the records indicate those were some of the first that were killed. If they had anything to do with America,
Yeah. Let me stay with you, Doug, and then we'll go to Mike and then Ron. Just any thoughts you have about, Ron said earlier that war is the closest thing to hell that we can have on earth. And of course, there's the famous phrase, war is hell. And some people, different veterans will say different things, and you're certainly free to see things differently, just based on your own experiences. But, if a basic definition of hell is the absence of God, then sometimes that's what vets mean when they say war is hell. But different sorts of spiritual challenges arise in the world of war. Any for you, any questions? I mean, sometimes the questions arise about, where is God in this kind of context?
Well, I don't know that I would say where is God, but I would tell you that it challenged every spiritual value I had. I didn't find God in the battlefield like happens sometimes to some people. And quite frankly, today, I still have questions. But I think as I look back over my life, and especially my time here at JBU, the teachings of the university reinforced many of my values as a young person growing up in Wyoming. But it was the John Brown Juniors of the world, the faculty and staff, all the Brown family through the years that established this university, I can tell you that that was the anchor that has kept my sanity.
Let me follow up on that, because your memoir is full of, really tough stories. It's just one tough story after another. But it's not only that. There were occasions when you were able to really be helpful to folks, and you tell the story of that free fire zone. But you were able to help some folks, if I remember correctly, help them get out of that free fire zone, and that was because of certain moral lines that you just would not cross. And would you be willing to share that story with us?
Well, for those who are familiar with Vietnam history, the My Lai massacre happened with some army troops at the time we were there, and that sort of thing is very easy to do. It's very easy to retaliate. I'm not finding fault with them at all. I just mentioned the time frame,
Sure.
But the collateral damage to civilians is horrible. And as a history professor, the carpet bombing in Europe and all that sort of thing. Civilians are who really, really pay the price. And I remember, on numerous occasions seeing South Vietnamese villagers that had been hit by napalm, and we didn't have any way of taking care of them. They would wrap their bodies and their limbs in banana tree leaves, and the oil out of the leaves would help lubricate their skin. And it's something that's mind-numbing, and you have to, for me, work every day to get by it. But in the particular day you're talking about, we were told that everything on this operation was to be killed. And as a tactic, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong would run civilians out in front of you to slow you down, or for propaganda purposes if you killed them. And on that particular day, my value system took over. Even my orders were to kill them all, and I just said I'm not doing it. And the military records now show that on that particular day there were 220 some civilians evacuated out of that area, that if we'd have followed the orders that I was sworn that I would take and obey, they would have been killed.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Doug. Ron or Mike, when you think of spiritual challenges associated with combat and the aftermath of combat, what comes to mind?
I feel like it would drive you crazy if you try to think about it. Why somebody next to you dies, the next person over next to you lives, what made them a better person than the other person. Like my wife says, God has your plan, and He has your days numbered before you're ever born. So it's not your day to die, I guess. I had tremendous amount of prayer support. I had John Brown University was a very small school when we were over there. I know Coach Parker wrote me while I was over there. Remember Coach Parker, basketball coach, giving me support. And I would do an awful lot of praying myself, especially at night. If you had inserted recon teams throughout the day, you're responsible for them. And I'd be praying all night long that they were protected, because if they weren't, that meant I would have to go out and try to get them. And God never got tired of listening to me, because I've been in His ear a lot.
Yeah. Ron, how about you? Spiritual challenges?
I think I'm dying here, so.
Uh-oh.
Mine was a little different. Of course, growing up and becoming a believer early on and coming here formed a foundation. The only thing I really remember is leaving Carroll in Pennsylvania and then went and stayed with another JBU grad, Alan Noble, in Redlands, California. Took off from Norton Air Force Base. And I remember distinctly in the DC-8, we were on our way to Anchorage, then on to Okinawa, and down in. But as the plane banked away from Norton in San Bernardino, a dark cloud kind of came over, and a voice that said, "You're not coming back."
Wow.
And that irritated me a little bit, but I knew that that was not of the Lord. And so I made it a point to know that our lives are in God's hands. As Mike mentioned, I don't know why it would make a difference, perhaps, but when a pilot would go down and be killed that was a Christian, weak theology here, I thought we were protected. It was another wake-up moment for me. And then there was Mike Cavanaugh. And so I think through the rest of your life, you say, God is with us. Our lives are in his hands. Keep going.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Mike and Mike Cavanaugh, and we've mentioned him. These are just some fellows as we've been talking over the past few weeks, several weeks. These are just a very small number of the very many names that you could give. And so, the point is not to exclude, but just to show these guys as representatives of the many more fellows who did not survive the war.
Can I just jump in here?
Sure,
I won't
please
do it
do,
again,
yeah,
but
please do.
Dick was a roommate of mine all through primary, and he was very kind. When Carol and I got married, he moved out of our spacious 8 by 40 foot mobile home, and which only lasted 1 week, by the way. But Dick married a Army widow, and then in July of 1970 went down in triple canopy jungle, not recovered, and so the widow was widowed twice.
Wow.
There's stories like that by the hundreds and thousands.
Yeah. More than 58,000 Americans, and then of course many from South Vietnam and the whole war. The numbers are catastrophic. Joey Devlin, also Ron knew him. Lyle Johnson, Doug knew him.
No, I didn't.
Or you just, or you knew, you actually replaced him, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah.
I met him, but
Right.
Captain Johnson took over Echo Company, and 3 days later was killed. And I was the only officer left in the entire battalion, and there was a high casualty rate in officers. So, and unfortunately, and this is mentioned in some books, I took over a rifle company, and I'd never even been a platoon commander. All I'd ever done was play basketball at Brown University. And
Yeah.
to say that was disconcerting to those troops is probably the understatement of the century.
Right. Well, one of the books there are 2 books on the table over there. One is by Daryl Horne, a Marine veteran who's here. And also I want to mention that we have Jerry Toller. Daryl and Jerry were both guests at an event we did here in February. One of the books is Daryl's memoir, and the other book is a memoir of Doug's radio operator. And his nickname was Kathy, right? Went by Kathy. And Kathy writes with great admiration about Captain Johnson. And then he also writes with great admiration about Doug, but he admits that he was a little skeptical at first when he found out that the officer who was replacing Captain Johnson had just basically distinguished himself as a basketball player, not yet in the field of battle.
I really think that taught those guys a lot about prayer, probably.
Yeah, probably did. And but the book over there, if you read it, you'll find that Kathy does come to respect Doug quite a bit. There's Michael Kelly.
Michael
Also
is
an
the
important
subject
story.
of my book
Yeah,
that I'm trying to decide whether to publish or not. And
yeah.
John Brown, Paul Simonis, if any of you know him, he was a 1999 graduate. both have helped me immeasurably in the writing of that, and of course your help too, Preston, has been immeasurable, and I hope if the Lord leads me to publish it, it'll be meaningful to people.
That's right. And there's no possible way to do justice to the story behind this in this kind of context, but tomorrow you and I will get together and try to work through this a bit, just telling the story. And then there's Christopher Bryant. Mike, why don't you just say a word about Chris?
Christopher was my cousin, 19 years old, Mangum, Oklahoma, which is a small town in the panhandle of Oklahoma. And Christopher checked into Vietnam on May 1 of 1968, and he was killed May 18th, 1968. So he's there 18 days.
Wow.
Just south of Hill 55, the areas that we operated on that day. I checked my logbook to see what I did that day after I found out that he was killed. And I operated and did and supported the area down there, taking out KIAs and WIAs throughout that day. I'll never know if I took his body out or not, but I kind of feel like I did. So.
Wow.
You know, it just struck me, Mike, what was the date that he was killed?
What's the date? Is either the 18th or the 19th.
Of March?
Of May.
May 68.
May. It was just
Yeah.
on the road, took fire from the Ville. It was on the road.
Well, let's come to this theme, and this is the last theme we'll discuss, and then we have a brief word from John Brown III, and then is Professor Cha here as well? There she is. Okay, and so then we have a brief word. First, actually, a brief word from Professor Cha, and then from John Brown III, and then we'll wrap it up. But this is just a short quote from Doug's memoir, "War Changes Everyone Forever," and of course, combat veterans will frequently say that. Ron, I mean, you know, you're flying this incredible machine, 23, all sorts of tough experiences. Not only tough experiences, but a lot of tough experiences. And you can't come out of that experience the same person you were when you went into it. How would you describe how the war changed you?
Well, I think if we've talked before, I was able to come back. I had 2 more years as a flight instructor in Santa Ana in California. I also went to Boeing test pilot school to help with the engineering side of what's back. But we left the Marine Corps also, and then we're 9 years in Indonesia flying with Mission Aviation Fellowship. So I've always felt that I was given a pathway forward to use my skills in a meaningful way. Church growth in Indonesia in the 70s was just unbelievable. We flew like crazy. We had a little more experience, but flying Cessna 185s in mountains and weather, but the mission was carry the folks that were taking the gospel, not only missionaries, but national church pastors. I even flew government. They had no other transportation in the west side in Borneo in the 70s. So when the governor would ask to fly, I would make sure we had a opening on his schedule. So just in short, are you able to pour yourself into something significant, use your skills? You could say you put it behind you, but it was more like moving forward.
Yeah.
Just kept moving forward.
I mean, learning to fly in stressful conditions, right? I mean, yeah, that definitely came in handy in your work after the war.
I did. I actually flew more hours every year in mission flying than I did in Vietnam. But it was very, very rewarding.
Sure.
Very
Mike, you said something that's, it's one of those things that just will stick with me. You said that, you didn't mention 412, but, you say that sometimes when you're driving, in your mind, you're actually in the helo flying over South Vietnam. How would you say the war changed you?
Well, excuse me. I don't think I've ever left it, to be truthful.
Yeah.
It's still with me. I've got a very, very understanding wife. But I've learned to accept a lot of things, and the things from the war is nothing basically is impossible. You set a goal, you try to achieve the goal. You can be more goal-orientated and stuff. And then again, my faith is, believe it or not, was strengthened from it.
Yeah. Doug, how about you? You go into the Corps, play basketball, end up in I Corps as an infantry officer, and
These guys are, again, I'm not trying to flatter them. I definitely don't want to flatter these two guys, but they're, as I said before, these are the true heroes of the Vietnam War. They volunteered, then they went over and served their country. I didn't. I got drafted, and it was in the early days of the conflict, and at that time, the President of the United States had appointed 3 civilians in each county, I guess, all over the United States. And they had the arbitrary responsibility to draft people without any qualification, no lottery, no nothing. And if you didn't have any money or didn't have any influence, you got drafted. And I was teaching school and coaching, and my first year out of John Brown had a new Corvette, and living like there's no tomorrow. And I did outrun Louis Thomas on a drag out here. That's a little in-house joke. Some of you are too young to appreciate that. But war gets glamorized. And show you how intelligent I was. I wanted to fly. I wanted to fly jets, and I had one eye. I couldn't. So my thought process was, well, I'll just go to the shortest officer candidate school there is, and that was the Marine Corps. And that's how I ended out in there. But and I'm proud. I'm a Marine, and I always will be. But the thing, as I mentioned earlier, I could have done without it, but obviously the Lord must have had something in mind. As an evangelical Christian, I've never been able to justify it, but especially in ambushes, and when you see the whites of their eyes, you don't stop and ask them if they have Jesus Christ as their personal Savior.
yeah.
And I would challenge the young people here today to prayerfully consider that before you ever get involved in a military conflict. But if you've seen the movie Patton, General Patton was speaking to the cadets at West Point, and he was talking about the object of war. And he says, and I'm quoting him now, so I apologize for the graphic nature of the language, but he said, the object of war is not to die for your country. The object of war is to make sure some other dumb poor bastard dies for his.
Yeah. And you know about that.
It's all about killing people and breaking things.
Yeah.
1 minute. 1 minute.
Yeah.
Doug, 3 times now, has heaped praise, unmerited praise, on a short story to reflect on the job he had. I was pulling out of a zone, had pulled everybody on. We were way too heavy, but we wanted to get the whole squad on. But a first lieutenant came up, stuck his head in the cockpit, and he was there. He said, "I wouldn't trade for your job anytime." Now, this is a man has mud up to his knees, leeches on his boots, scrapes and scratches everywhere. 1 dead Marine in the back, 3 wounded. I said, "Sir, I wouldn't trade for your job either." That's the job that Doug had. Had the last word. We're out of time.
Doug, do you want to counter?
Gee, look at the...
You want to counter? No. Okay. Well, let's bring up Professor Cha, who is a professor here at JBU, and also will speak as a member of the local Hmong community, and she'll have a few words, and then we'll hear from John Brown III.
Nyajong. That's the greeting in my native Hmong language. My name is Lu, and I was born in the country of Laos in 1972. I am a Hmong refugee of the Vietnam War. Because the Vietnam War was not only fought in Vietnam, it spilled also into the country of Laos, my native homeland. The Hmong people are an indigenous people, a minority group in Southeast Asia and in southern China. And during the Vietnam War, the Hmong lived in the highlands of Laos, Thailand, Vietnam. During this time, especially in 1959, when the Viet Minh decided to build and construct the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail that went from North Vietnam down to South Vietnam came through the highlands of Laos, down to Cambodia, down to South Vietnam. And so this trail came through the homeland, through the villages and towns of the Hmong people that lived in the highlands of Laos. As the communists came through the northern parts of Laos, they pillaged villages. They supported the communist Pathet Lao that was being established also in the country of Laos. In order to disrupt the North Vietnamese from getting supplies and soldiers down to South Vietnam, and in order to help fight the communist Pathet Lao that was rising up in Laos, the United States government came into Laos and recruited General Vang Pao, a Hmong soldier who had gained rank within the Royal Lao Army, to establish Hmong guerrilla forces in northern Laos. Stationed in Long Cheng, General Vang Pao led Hmong soldiers, men, women, young children, young boys as young as 10 years old, to help stop the supply line through the northern Laos, and also to retrieve pilots, American pilots, that were shot down during the bombing operations over northern Laos. From 1963 to 1975, over 30,000 Hmong soldiers and 50,000 Hmong civilians were killed in the secret war in Laos. When the US pulled out of Vietnam in 1975, they also pulled out of Laos. And the newly established communist Pathet Lao government persecuted the Hmong and targeted them for extermination. Over 200,000 Hmong refugees fled from Laos into neighboring Thailand, lived in made-up refugee camps, waiting for immigration into other Western countries. My family and I arrived here in the United States in 1979 when I was 7 years old. And like many Hmong refugees, we had very little knowledge of English or American culture. We had no education, no money, no possessions, only the clothes that we had on our backs that were given to us in the refugee camps. As refugees, we mourn the loss of our loved ones who died in the war. We mourn the loss of our homes and villages. And we struggled to recreate a new life for ourselves and for our families here in the United States. According to the 2010 census, there are over 260,000 Hmong who have resettled here in the United States since the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. 3,000 of them live here in Oklahoma, and 2,000 of them live here in Arkansas. Because of the Vietnam War, the Hmong story has been woven into the very fabric of the American story. To the American and Hmong soldiers who courageously fought for freedom, who were killed in the hills, in the jungles, in the rice paddies of Laos and Vietnam, we honor you today. To our loved ones who died in the waters of the Mekong and the refugee camps in Thailand, we remember you. To the American families and churches who sponsored and welcomed us, even though we were aliens and strangers and immigrants in this foreign country, we thank you. To all those who have survived the Vietnam War, who have endured great pain and suffering, we pray God's grace and his healing upon you. To our speakers especially, Doug, and Mike and Ronald, we salute you and we thank you. Today, I am Assistant Professor of Christian Ministry and Formation here at Brown University. But in 1975, after the end of the Vietnam War, I was just 3 years old, fleeing for my life, fleeing to Thailand, living in refugee camps. And I deeply appreciate the sacrifices of American veterans and Hmong veterans, because I know that the life that I have now, the life that all of us have now, and the freedoms that we have, it has been purchased through the blood and sacrifice of others. So thank you. And I deeply appreciate you and what you have done for me indirectly and for the Hmong people that are now here in the United States. So thank you, and God bless you.
Preston, you didn't tell me that I would have to follow such an eloquent speaker here. And thank you so much. I know these three gentlemen appreciate that, those heartfelt words as well. Is this on? No. Okay, let's try it now. Now I can hear myself. But thank you, and I know these three gentlemen thank you as well. And thank you, Preston, for putting this together, which is really a JBU memory card as well. I knew all three of these guys. They were college students when I was in high school here, and I looked up to all three of them. Ron, I knew, was an impressive, well-spoken guy. He was dating a cute young lady named Carol Wagner, right? Was that the maiden name? Yeah, yeah. Their daughter Jody is here with their family. Good to see y'all. But I remember seeing you around campus, and you're quite an item on campus in those days. Mike Bryant holds a special place in my heart. He was a championship competitive swimmer. You probably didn't have time to catch that on the slides there, but in 1960, what was the year you went to the NAIAs?
62.
62. That's what I was thinking. It seemed like a long time ago. The JBU swim team placed 10th in the nation in NAIA in the national swim meet. We had one swimmer, Mike Bryant. And so Mike had good training in Oklahoma, and about that time, Hub White, for whom the natatorium is named, had started a summer swim program. And I was nearsighted and couldn't hit a baseball to save my life, so I decided I'd be a swimmer, and I started doing competitive swimming with Hub White. So my dad thought, well, I'm going to help John do something with himself here, so he recruited Mike to be my swim coach. And I asked him again tonight how much my dad paid, and he couldn't remember, so we think maybe he told him he'd extend his scholarship one more semester or something. But Mike, one thing I told him I remember well, the old pool down in the valley at the base of the 100 steps had a crack in it. So it kept leaking water. Hub gave me my first job when I was 14, 50 cents an hour. That's you're going to pay me to be a lifeguard at a swimming pool. That was the best job I ever had, really. So it kept filling up with cold water. Mike would be ready for the swim lesson. He'd just run and jump in the water. And I mean, it was cold, frigid. So I'd kind of ease in my toes. And Mike would always tell me, John, being cold is just in your head. So I thought differently, but he fooled me. But he was my hero, one of my heroes. Another one was Doug Chamberlain. And I loved basketball. The summers were spent down in the old gym down in the valley, the old wooden gym. Lee Netherton's here tonight. Lee, good to see you. And was of that same era, one of our retired faculty. Some of you all may not know, but Lee's back there, played on the team with Doug and maybe Mike Castleman. I saw him in the back there as well, who's also a Vietnam vet. Mike, good to have you. But student athletes were my heroes.
and I looked up to them and wanted to emulate them. And as they've said, the 60s were such an unusual time. We haven't really alluded to it, but in 1964, I actually served as a page in Washington, D.C. Our congressman at that time gave me an appointment. I lived up there 6 weeks. And it was during the time that President Johnson sent the Gulf of Tonkin resolution over to Congress for passage. Supposedly there'd been an incident where North Vietnamese gunboats had fired on U.S. warships. I have the resolution. I used to use it in my class for political science. So I was there while it was debated, and I have a copy of it. And it was the resolution which allowed Johnson to go forward with troop buildup and other kinds of reprisals and so forth, military actions against the Viet Cong and North Vietnam in particular. And of course, later we came to know that there was no Gulf of Tonkin incident. It didn't happen. A lot of other things that we came to know, even during that time. I've heard these guys talk about the disillusionment and the things that we've heard more recently with the releasing of tapes of Johnson and Robert McNamara and others talking about what may be a futile effort in Vietnam. What are we doing? How are we going to get out of this? How do we convince the American people that we should go forward? All the while these guys were risking their lives, and others of you who are here tonight. So but during that era, it was the height of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King and his march in Birmingham, was it the trash collectors, the sanitation workers strike and so forth, and he'd been put in jail during that time. The assassination of John Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Robert Kennedy, who was Attorney General and then a senator from New York. Some people see things as they are and ask why. Other people see things as they might become and say, why not? Martin Luther King, I believe in the rule of law, and I show that by being willing to be imprisoned for not obeying a law that I consider to be an unjust law. That era, there was turmoil. And then on top of that, here's the Vietnam War. Lots of discussion on college campuses, demonstrations, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in '68. I mean, we had a lot going on. I've heard these guys say, if you're sincere, it's a matter of faith. They put their lives on the line for the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the values that we treasure in this country. But if you're simply avoiding your duty as a citizen, then I don't respect that. These guys stepped forward. I remember when I was 18, I watched the TV. I remember the night, watched that big globe that had the little ping pong balls in it. And out would pop a number. July the 1st fell in the 90s. That's my birthday. That meant I had a low draft number. I was able to finish here at JBU and go on and join the ROTC program at the U of A, and we have some of those students here tonight. I've been privileged to meet. Graduated, was commissioned in '73. When I graduated from JBU in '71, we'd been at it for 10 years, covert as well as overt war in Vietnam. We didn't see an end. We didn't know that there would be one. Nixon eventually started pulling the troops out in '72, and some of the things that happened then. But the politics, the turmoil, the protests, the discussion, the debate, amidst all of that, these guys stepped forward, and they saw their duty, and they did it for us. I want to mention one other thing that my classmate, Nell Bryant, Mike's wife, and I were talking about, a young man named Rex Blizzard, and I carry his memory with me. We grew up together, Blizzard and Brown. We were often seated together, in those elementary classes, you sit by the alphabet. His dad worked in the 50s for JBU. He helped make the pews in the cathedral sanctuary. So every Tuesday and Thursday, you students, when you have chapel, you can thank Rex Blizzard's dad. Rex was a good old boy from the country here. Loved rodeo and horses and cows. Went to Arkansas Tech for a semester after we graduated in '67. Didn't work out that well. And in spring of '68, he'd been drafted, he'd been through basic. He came back to Siloam, and we had the carnival going down on Benton Street, right down the hill here from the campus. And Stephanie and I ran into Rex, and he was with a young lady named Sherry Whitlock. If that name sounds familiar, that's the name of the highway north of town that goes by the rodeo grounds. Sherry was a beautiful rodeo queen, national queen. And actually, I was writing for the newspaper here in Siloam for 3 years while I was in college. And I made the suggestion to our mayor that we rename the street out there Sherry Whitlock Drive. They got engaged, maybe that night, I'm not sure, but Rex and Sherry got engaged. And he left for Vietnam, had his orders that night. I asked him, he had the haircut. And I remember the look in his eyes when I asked him if he knew where he was going after basic. He said, yeah, I've got my orders for Vietnam. That fall in '68, I went up to high school to file a report on the football game. And Glenn Black, superintendent of schools, was coming down the sidewalk. And he said, well, we've just had word one of our boys in Vietnam was killed. And that was Rex. He was in a Jeep, a roadside IUD or bomb, whatever went off, and he was killed. And so we've always wanted to recall his service, his bravery. He was one of ours. His life was changed forever, just like these guys. And to me, it helped me to understand my Christian faith. I didn't have to go. I didn't have to serve like these guys. A wife, 5 beautiful children, now 12 grandchildren. And so this is the thought I would close with, a familiar one from Gospel of John 15:13. And this is for these guys as well who went. Greater love has no one than this, that one laid down his life for his friends. Thank you all, and thank you guys.